Homer's repetition of stealing is a pretty tenuous jumping-off point for the different ideas that can be conjured by the word, but it will probably do. Stealing has a wide range of practical and moral interpretations, some of which I've experienced, some of which I haven't. Is it wrong to steal a loaf of bread to feed your starving family? Probably not, but the depths of rightness and wrongness depend on where you're stealing from. If it's from a market trader who's on the breadline, that's probably worse than stealing from a publicly traded corporation that doesn't pay its workers a living wage. But then, any trader is profiting from the labor of other people, so maybe that justifies it. Probably more relevant than that clapped-out analogy is to think about much bigger heists, such as the way the majority of humans are forced to sell their labor for less than it's worth, or the fact that taxation laws only apply to people without the resources to circumvent them. Stealing is something that affects everyone in an at least vaguely significant way, which is why I've decided to gas about it today, with particular reference to game design, and how it can recreate that thrill people probably feel when indulging in some ethical stealing. Magic the Gathering is a game with a propensity to subvert its core rules on the reg. You could argue that anti-authoritarianism is written into the game's DNA, but that's a discussion for another day. Magic is chock full of stealing effects. Considering how startlingly they break the usual creature combat rules, and how powerfully they can swing a gain, there's been surprisingly little written or theorized about them. Be Careful with Stealing is an interesting read, although its author sadly missed the obviously excellent title, The Only Rule of Stealing is Don't Get Caught, in an article about the rules of stealing, plus it's from 12 years ago. So let's give ourselves a bit of context. As you'll probably know if you're reading this, stealing things, and by things I mean permanents, is primarily the domain of Blue. I find this slightly at odds with the central philosophies of Blue, the pursuit of knowledge and perfection, the self-improvement and inward examination, where Blue is most closely aligned with Black, and a somewhat watered-down version of German idealism via Schelling and Hegel, but whatever, does not seem to me inclined to jack other people's shit. That said, the idea that Blue is able to coerce or convince creatures to join its side is a compelling and flavorful one, as is the idea of a more organized theft. See, for example, the card, and more specifically the artwork for Stolen Goods, which suggests a network of thieves probably kicking up to an underworld bureaucrat. If you were to push a little harder on this, you would probably end up somewhere in White's color pie. Wage theft, for example, would absolutely be Blue-White. See also propaganda. Overall, though, I think it works in Blue. Stealing things in Blue is not the kind of stealing I generally want to do. An opponent permanently stealing something you previously controlled gives intense feel-bads, which I imagine are similar to being burgled. Probably more importantly, it doesn't allow for much complexity or counterplay. With enchantment-based stealing, you usually want to steal your opponent's best creature. You steal it with the enchantment, they bounce it if they can, something again only usually Blue can do, or blow up the enchantment if they can, something usually only Green and White can do. The legendary creature, Trostani Discordant, has the excellently designed ability of returning all creatures each player owns back to their control. The effect is originally from the land card, Homeward Path. The flavor seems off, as the Trostani of Guilds of Ravnica is discordant rather than harmonious, but we can stick to the mechanic for now. Melissa DeTora's article mentions that they designed the text as counterplay to cards like Hostage Taker and Connive Concoct, which was released in the same set. Alas, its utility didn't really enjoy that much play outside of these use cases, but the hard counter to permanent stealing was cool to see. Stealing things in red is the kind of stealing I want to do. It's nearly always temporary and highly conditional, such that you feel you've earned the payoff when you use it well, rather than just scuttling your opponent's stuff over onto your playmat. From an ethical perspective, it feels like the kind of stealing that's closer to the person stealing a loaf of bread to feed their starving family, or more complex situations, like workers stealing back the value of their labor that's being systematically stolen from them. It ain't pretty, but unpretty stealing is probably the most elegant variety. Speaking of robbing from the rich and giving to the relatively poor, what better demonstration than Robber of the Rich? Robber of the Rich is not legendary, so it can't technically be your commander, but this serves a broader purpose. It is pretty much a strict upgrade from a gameplay perspective, unless you care about historic, legendary matters stuff, which no doubt helped it onto many of the top tables of the standard of its day. Much more importantly than that, it taps into one of the best and most socialist aspects of Robin Hood, that his legend was probably more down to various robbers giving the name than it was to any anomalous and benevolent individual. He has haste because he's fast, and reach because he's an archer, but the important ability, of course, is the one that lets you rob cards from opponents who have more. In order to use it, Robber of the Rich wants you to dump your hand so that you can switch it on. You also need to have attacked with a specific creature type, so you need to be aggressive, and you need to be poor in order for it to rob stuff for you. How do you do that? Play a hyper-aggressive deck with lots of one-mana spells. The balance applied to this card's potentially powerful ability is that you have to be lower on cards than your opponent in order to switch it on. I've heard a fair amount of whinging from the usual suspects about how this makes it too much of a snowbally card, amazing when you're ahead and kinda useless when you're behind, but I like the design, mainly because it hints at some pretty fertile ground in Red's part of the color pie. The balance, in my opinion, does not have to come from having fewer cards in your hand. It could come from having a lower life total, though this is potentially more deal with the devil territory. Either way, it gives me a third opportunity to drop the steel bread to feed your starving family metaphor. Some other kind of aggro trigger, like having dealt damage, similar to the spectacle mechanic, or even a time-related clause that would chime with Red's impulsiveness and love of instants. You may play this card as if it were an instant until this combat phase ends. Red Theft is impulsive, passionate, and, to an extent, essential. It's a great gaming injustice where Atali the Primal Storm, who can exile the top card of everyone's libraries and cast them for free, attracts more hate than a rando blue-green commander, which can make all the mana it wants, draw as many cards as it likes from its own library, and find a predefined win con from its own deck. One of the best things about Theft, at least from a card design standpoint, is that there are a rich variety of synonyms and near synonyms for it, probably because the people who do it, or are forced to do it, are more varied and interesting than the people who view the act merely as a crime to be punished. We have, of course, the card Hijack, but there's also Jack and Joyride with specific reference to vehicles. Twok is an excellent word in British English born from the acronym of cop slang, taking without the owner's consent. Usually it refers to cars too, but there is no rule I wouldn't bend to get Twok put onto a card. Violent theft, or robbery, can add direct damage to the equation, either by requiring some kind of damage to be inflicted on a creature or planeswalker, or adding direct damage as part of the spell for a bit of an extra mana cost, which could even be paid from the caster's own life total. An essay is just a starting point for a broader discussion, so how do you feel about stealing in Magic, or in other games? It doesn't have to be a comment here, tweet me, or start your own thread. I have a probably overly political take on things, so I'm keen to hear other opinions. Thanks for watching.